budget. So for water revenues, we had a budget annually for $80.8 million. We are right now at $69.3 million, and that includes water sales, the service charge, and the watershed management fee. Other revenues were at 95%. So those are things like rents, grants, and watershed payments, interest that we get on the portfolio. And we're at $3.3 million versus a budget of $3.5 million. So overall, for total operating revenues, we're at 86.1%. So a little bit ahead of that 83.3% bar for the year. The fire flow fee, we're at $4.3 million versus a budget of $4.5 million. That's 95%. And that's just because, as you recall, the fire flow fee comes in primarily in the December and April property tax payments. So most of that is already received in April. And then capital revenues, which includes the CMF, budgeted $16.5 million, and additional connection fees was a total of $19 million for budget, and we're at $14.5 million. So we're lagging a little bit there. We're at 76% versus that 83%. And part of that is that our CMF revenues, as we talked about last time, will probably come a little bit under that projection the first year, just to the timing of the cash inflows. So the next slide, we always show you our monthly water sales comparison, and in dollars, you can see kind of a trend where we've, in the first 2 months of the fiscal year, in July and August, we're running a little bit behind the previous year, 2019. And as we hit September, we were about even. And then every month since September, for this fiscal year, we've been ahead of revenues for last year. And as you can imagine, a lot of that, February and March were very dry years this year compared to last year. April is about the same, but the way that our billing cycle is, some of those billing cycles go back to February. So it's about what we would expect. So a pretty marked increase, about 24% in revenues for the month of April compared to last year. And as you kind of blend that in with the rest of the year, as mentioned in the packet, that puts us about 10% ahead overall for the fiscal year through April 30th. So the next slide that we added in, it's a little bit different cut on this. There were some questions last time, I think, about how this breaks out by the different categories. So what we gave you here was a slide comparing fiscal year 19 to 20 for the various categories. So we start out with single family. So this year, we're about, for the month of April, we're about 351 CCFs ahead of last year. And again, that's primarily due to dry weather. For multifamily units, from duplexes up to units 10 plus, we're pretty much flat. Everything's almost totally flat there. For institutional, we're seeing an increase of about 29 CCFs, which is about a 5% increase over last year. Commercial and industrial is flat, very flat. So we probably will see some declines as we move into future months and we start capturing those billing cycles that would have been affected by COVID. I was just reading a report that Raftelis did for AWWA, kind of looking nationwide at how this is impacting. And most water agencies are seeing decreases because of commercial industrial of about 6 to 10% in their revenues. We just aren't reflecting that quite yet. Irrigation is up about 6 or 7%. Raw water fell by about 50%. And I think the reason for that is that before we were capturing San Geronimo, and that's no longer the case. Now it's just Meadow Club. And then recycled water is up about 40% over last year. And again, that's attributed primarily to the dry weather. The next slide that we show you is year-to-date tier water consumption. We are up for this year. Again, same comments before based on the dry weather. And as this slide shows, about 90% of our water usage is in those first two tiers, tier 1 and tier 2, with the remaining 10% in those tier 2 and tier 3 levels. So now we're moving over to the expenditure side. So we'll start off with the major objects, personnel services. That includes wages, benefits, PERS costs, everything. We're budgeted at $49.8 million. Right now we're at $40.4 million, so 81%. Remember, at this point of year, we're normally about 83% of budget. So we're a little bit behind on budget for personnel services, and that can be expected. We do have a number of vacancies. Latest reports about 12 vacancies in the district. You know, rough math with 240 FTEs, about 5% vacancy. So that's probably primarily what's causing us to lag behind on personnel services. Maintenance and operating expense is well behind budget. We budgeted $29.2 million for the fiscal year. We're at $20.2 million, or about 70% versus that 83% mark. So a couple things are happening there. We budget $1 million for watershed maintenance. And we've only used about $500,000 of that so far. And then, as you would imagine, with this event, we've seen a significant decrease in professional services. So a lot of those contracts aren't being utilized as much as they would if it were business as usual. The financing costs, budget of $10.4 million. We're at $8.7 million right on budget, and that's obviously those financing costs are pretty fixed. They're on those three major bonds that you have, and then another number of smaller financing tools that we have out there. So that's a planned expenditure, and that is right on budget. Our capital allocation is $3.9 million, about 86% of what we had planned. And then fire flow projects are significantly under budget. They're about 25% of budget. We budgeted $4.5 million. We've expended $1.1 million. And as you'll see in the next slide, we had spent that fund down to a negative balance. So by design right now, we're spending less on fire flow projects and getting that fire flow fund back to a healthy level. And then district projects, these are capital projects and capital equipment purchases. We're about 55% of budget of $20 million, and we've expended $11.1 million. And capital projects we've seen those slowing down this year. So next we will go to fund balance. And I think if you look on page 8 of your package, you can follow along with this. So our restricted and designated fund, and that's for things like workers' comp, general liability, debt service. That's at $15.7 million as of April 30th, compared to the previous fiscal year end at $14.3 million. Rate stabilization fund is stable at $9.4 million. We obviously haven't dipped into that during this fiscal year, so that stayed exactly the same. Fire flow fund, as we talked about at the time of the audit last year, June 30th, we were negative $1.4 million in that fund. Because we've slowed down the expenditures versus the revenues on that, we've brought that fund up to positive $1.8 million balance. Pension reserve fund remains at $2 million. We haven't had to dip into that to address any variances in payments to PERS. And then the capital fund went from $24 million to $24.2 million, increased $200,000 there. So that leaves our total restricted and designations at $53.1 million. And then unrestricted, we have $31.1 million. So that would really be what I would consider your true reserve. And so that gives us total fund balance of $84.2 million compared to $75.7 million at June 30th. So just some of the usual statistics that we give you. Our operating fund balance to budget in months is 4.4. I think we target 6 months there, but that's kind of an aspirational target. Our debt service coverage is projected at 2.5. Outstanding bond debt is $144.7 million. That's down about $3 million from last year since we've defeased some of that through debt service payments. And then other debt, those are those smaller debts that we have with places like Las Colinas Sanitary. We have some energy efficiency bonds. The balance there is $7.8 million versus $8.2 million at year end. So now we'll move into capital expenditures. As I said, most of these are running behind budget. So the biggest one in there is the pipeline replacement. We had $7 million budgeted. We're at 76% of budget at $5.3 million expended through April 30th. Tank replacement, we have $600,000 budgeted there. We haven't expended anything. That's primarily budgeted for the Ross Reservoir repair. We have treatment plant upgrades at $2.1 million, of which we've expended $400,000. And you will recall that the San Geronimo project is on hold. And then we have dam pump control system meter replacements budgeted $3.1 million, and we're at about 50% of that at $1.5 million. System improvements, a very small $600,000 budget, and that's for those transmission distribution pumps. So we're $100,000 on that. We have $100,000 budgeted for the Rangers residents, and we have not expended any of that yet. Watershed road improvements, which includes culverts, was budgeted at $1.3 million. We're at $600,000 or 42% of budget there. Capital projects, we have a reimbursable grant that's primarily for AMI. We've expended $2.2 million of a budget of $3.4 million, so we're at about 65% there. Reimbursable customer projects, things like changing out meters, we're at half our budget at $700,000 versus $1.5 million in budget. And then information technology, we've expended $100,000 through April 30th compared to a $400,000 budget, and that's primarily for ERP improvements and updates. Fire flow replacement, as we talked about, we budgeted $4.5 million, but we've only expended $1.1 million by design to get that fund back to a healthy balance. Capital equipment purchases, $100,000 versus a budget of $1.3 million. So that's where we look at that. And then one of the slides that we showed you last time, we're keeping track of what we're expending based on the impacts of COVID-19. And last month we showed you the year-to-date expense through the end of March at $150,000. Now we're at $184,000. So the burn rate there is not high. That's being used for things like deep spray buildings and vehicles. We've added janitorial services to keep the building sanitary. Additional sick leave is allowed under CARES Act. And then we've been tracking employee time that's spent specifically on COVID. So that's $184,000 through April 30th. And then one other thing we just wanted to mention was the board did pass a number of customer assistant measures at an earlier meeting. So as you recall, one of the things that we're doing is forestalling the rate increase to January, and there's an expectation that'll have about $2 million impact to us on the revenue side. So we've been working to look at ways to address that. I think the way we're looking so far, as we showed you earlier, we've got some additional revenues that have come in just because of a drier year, so that will help out. As I mentioned earlier, also right now we're running about 5% in vacancies. So if you're doing some rough math, and we've got a payroll of about $50 million. That's a 5% savings will be about $2.5 million. So that'll help tremendously towards addressing that $2 million shortfall that we're going to have next year. So at this time, sorry to do that without the visual effects for you, but that's our report for the month of April. We can address any questions you might have.
Thanks, Chuck. My one quick question is about the last point you made. On the one hand, I appreciate the savings in keeping positions open for a bit, but we are also concerned about ensuring a high level of service at this time, especially on the customer service end of things. So can you talk a little bit about what the impact is in terms of keeping those positions open? Or maybe that's a question for
Yeah, I'll jump in for that, Cynthia. We are, as we're proceeding, and I noted last time we did bring a number of summer temporary positions the last board meeting and 2 permanent ones. Next month, not on Tuesday, the following Tuesday, we're going to bring 2 to 3 additional positions. So we're going to fill Greg's position on the watershed, the fishery manager who's retiring. And we're going to be bringing kind of an instrument tech supervisor position that's critical. So I have heard the board and appreciate the support to fill positions, very much so. And we do run a lean organization, so every vacant position is felt here. We did want to, I wanted to get a good sense of what Chuck just talked about, of how we would fill the $2 million revenue gap. But because of the pandemic and things have slowed down, we can't really use capital dollars, but there's other dollars that haven't been spent that we'll be able to carry forward into next year. So we are looking fairly good, and we will be moving forward with, you'll be seeing at subsequent board members meetings, some positions coming forward.
Okay. I think I hadn't realized that Greg was retiring. What's his end date, or has he left already?
Yeah, no, it's in June, and he'll be, we're going to bring a resolution
Okay.
at the second meeting in June, I believe.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a big hit, and there's a lot of thought going into finding a very strong replacement.
Yeah, big shoes to fill. My goodness.
Andrews.
Yeah.
There is, on that point, Ben, there is a move afoot, which I don't think you've heard about, but you will, because I'll forward you the emails, to the possibility of generating a resolution from the Board of Supervisors for all the work Greg has done as well. So
Wow.
that would be, so I'll send that to you a little bit later today.
Well, that's great to know, Jack. Thanks for sharing. I think he'd really appreciate that, and it's certainly well deserved.
Absolutely well deserved. Yeah.
Okay. Those are my questions. Any other board questions on Chuck's presentation?
I've got just a couple questions on interest. Looks like we earned over $1 million in interest, 400% of expected revenue there. So that looks like an $800,000 pickup on interests. So any explanation for that?
No, WAVE has been doing pretty well this year. I think earlier we were at about 1.7% in return. So, you apply that to a portfolio of $75 million. That's, that math is about right. You are going to see some slowdown in interest. Interest rates have been falling in the last 2 months. So WAVE has been coming down substantially. So you'll probably see a little bit of a drop off in that going forward.
And then are we seeing any, are you noticing any slowdown on customer payments?
Yeah, we have seen an increase in delinquencies. Yep.
I'd be interested in tracking that during finance committees.
Absolutely.
I agree. Thank you for that.
Can get that information. And then the other thing, as far as, the jump in April, 23% increase in consumption. Do we have date? Can we get some more data like from that Tiburon cohort we have, where you guys were kind of tracking usage? Because I'd like to see if there's been an increase since the shelter-in-place order, whether there's any interesting data we can get about water consumption since the shelter-in-place order went into effect.
Yeah, we can definitely look to AMI data to get a little more real-time data. I'm not familiar with the Tiburon.
Well, it's just the biggest cohort I think we have of that AMI data.
That's where the grant monies were spent, Charlie.
Got it.
Is in Tiburon. That's why there's no meters.
We can do that, Larry. The staff has been thinking about, and they have a strategy of looking at the timing that would likely not show irrigation. So we'd be able to bring to the board what's increased of the increase, what do we attribute to irrigation, and is there a delta we're seeing from consumption in turn?
Yeah. I mean, if it can be done without, pulling your hair out, if it's available. So
actually, that is what's so powerful about AMI. You really have data.
It's there. Yeah. Good. So I think that's about it. The only other thing I was thinking of is that jump in April, it does kind of raise some red flags about conservation and stuff, but we talked about that at our last meeting. So just it's interesting to see consumption jumping and what's really behind it.
It is, and if I could just note, when we were looking at the slides, Chuck and I were really trying to understand it. A large part of it is attributed to, of course, we have a 2-month billing cycle.
Right.
So when we're looking at this month, we're really catching a good part of February, which of course was the driest in history. So next month will be that much more informative because we'll be in more sort of normal water conditions, and the year to year will be more telling.
Yeah.
Right. I think Armando has a question.
Yeah, I think it's important to put together a thoughtful narrative around water usage, because if you go to any nurseries in Marin right now, their vegetable seedling supplies are toast. Everybody's putting in gardens, and they've not put gardens in before. I'm a beekeeper and I keep chickens, and I can also tell you that this spring you could not find chickens anywhere.
That's what I heard.
So there's all these new activities that may not have to do with hand washing and the things that we, assign to COVID. And so I think a thoughtful narrative is really important when we put this together, because I think we also have to acknowledge, that sort of those soft things that are having an impact. So anyway.
And sort of just they are somewhat related to COVID, because this is what folks are doing.
Yeah.
Right. They're right. They're indirectly related. It's not right.
Right. And
People are home, and so they're doing new things. So.
And then, like I say, a thoughtful narrative. And also, I've been baking bread. It's amazing how much water you eat baking bread, and everybody's doing that. So
Everyone's doing it.
Shortage.
I think it would just be an interesting narrative that is broad.
Exactly. I agree. Okay. Any other questions on the financial report?
I'd like to thank Chuck. I thought that, Chuck, your report was really clear, easy to follow. We tracked.
Yeah.
It was very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I agree.
Maybe it's better without the slides.
Right.
Slides are
So
helpful.
it was well done. And then we actually did receive the slides by email. So I'm going to request, I don't know if there's members of the public listening, but I'm going to request that we put them up on the website today, just in case there are any members of the public who either missed the meeting or attended the meeting, but weren't able to see them. So if we could do that, that would be terrific.
Actually, they're going up right now.
Excellent.
Almost done.
Even
Right.
better. Such a good staff we have. Thank you very much for all your
Really?
efforts.
Did we ask for public comment?
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there public comment on the financial report?
There is no public comment.
Okay. Then I'm just going to once again thank the staff for this great report and this, very informative, and for all of the work that you're doing under these very challenging circumstances. And I think it is telling that even our friends at the IJ seems to think that we're on a good track right now. So
Yeah.
we must be doing something right.
Yep.
All right. I think with that, we are adjourned. Have a safe day, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Stay healthy.
Yep.
Bye.